This is one of the problems that governments have, and I think business leaders have this too, is they set the wrong expectations. You should not say this endeavor, this plan, this bit of legislation, this policy, this investment in this new sales agenda, I guarantee it is going to deliver X, Y, Z. You can say, this is the best idea we've got at the moment. We hope it will do X, Y, Z, but we are monitoring it very carefully. And if it underperforms, we will cut it quick and do something else. I always found if you set the expectations right at the outset, it gives you a lot more flexibility.
This is KBKast.
Are they completely
As a
cybersecure?
primary target for ransomware campaigns,
Is
that's used to
security and
point
testing and performance and scalability.
risk and
We
compliance.
can actually automate that.
Take that data and use it.
Joining me now is the Honourable Mr. Malcolm Turnbull, Australia's 29th Prime Minister. Now, before entering politics at 50, Mr. Malcolm Turnbull had already built an impressive international career, successfully defending former MI5 agent Peter Wright in the landmark spy catcher trial, founding his own investment banking firm and later becoming a partner at Goldman Sachs. He also co-founded Ozmail, one of Australia's first tech companies to be listed on the NASDAQ. As Prime Minister, he led major reforms across tax, education, and childcare, oversaw the legislation of same-sex marriage, and launched Snowy Hydro 2.0, the largest pumped hydro project in the Southern Hemisphere. He also delivered Australia's first national cybersecurity strategy and oversaw the nation's largest peacetime investment in defence capabilities. On the global stage, he played a key role in reviving the Trans-Pacific Partnership after the United States withdrew and negotiated directly with both President Obama and President Trump on complex refugee agreements. Since leaving office, he's returned to the business as a senior advisor to KKR, chairman of Fortescue Future Industries, and a strategic advisor to Semperis, continuing to shape conversations around cybersecurity, geopolitical, and renewable energy. Please join me in welcoming the Honourable Mr. Malcolm Turnbull.
Thank you very much, Carissa. Great to be with you.
Okay, so Mr. Turnbull, first question for you today would be, you argued in office that cyber had become part of the national security frontier, and your government responded with a formal cybersecurity strategy in 2016. So looking back now, do you still see cybersecurity as a distinct policy domain, or should it always have been treated primarily as a question of sovereignty and statecraft rather than as sort of a technical or a law enforcement problem? I know that's a long-winded question, but I'm super curious to hear your answer.
Well, I don't think I certainly didn't put cybersecurity in a box. There used to be a time, I don't know, say 10 years ago, when people would talk about the digital economy. And I used to make the point at the time that there wasn't a digital economy, the economy was digital, right? But, there was this idea that there was the sort of normal economy and then there was this weird digital economy on the side. And I guess the point you're driving at is that some people see cybersecurity as a distinct domain, but the reality is because everything we do is enabled by, digital platforms, most of which are, almost all of which are connected to the internet, cybersecurity is a risk, an issue for everything. So, it's you're right. It is part of statecraft. It is part of sovereignty. It is a completely, it's a universal element. I hope that wasn't the impression that was given from the cybersecurity strategy. Look, it was 10 years ago for a start, but just to put this into a bit of context, I became Prime Minister in 2015. Unlike a lot of people in politics, I had had quite a extensive career before I was in Parliament. I got into Parliament when I was 50, so I wasn't, a boy. And I had been involved with the internet and telecoms companies and businesses for a long time before that. I was one of the founders of a company called Ozmail, which, your grandparents probably have an account with, but it was the first sort of big ISP in Australia. And so, it's a world I was familiar with. I'm not a technical person, and I've had a reputation for being tech savvy that is very flattering, but it is, it's way beyond my actual knowledge. But, going back 10 years ago, most of the people in Parliament, and I would say a lot of the senior civil servants, were very unfamiliar with the digital world. They sort of even struggled with concepts. And so the cyber security strategy was the first one Australia had. I mean, that was an initiative of mine. And the idea was to really raise awareness of these issues. And clearly it was important for government. And, part of what we did was expand the role and budget and authority of the Australian Signals Directorate, which is the Australia's equivalent of the NSA in the US or GCHQ in the UK. And, it's obviously a big part of the Five Eyes Signals Intelligence Partnership, but also, created, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, which is designed to be the, public interface between the Signals Directorate and all of its expertise and the corporate world. Because one of the most important objectives in the cybersecurity strategy was, in addition to promoting Australian cybersecurity innovation and Australian cybersecurity startups, for example, it was to make business aware of it. One of my kind of stock questions used to be when I was talking with CEOs and directors of big companies and law firms and so forth, is to say, do you know who has administrative privileges over your network? Who can actually get in, who can control, who manages the identity of all of your employees, which of course is, relevant to Semperis, the company one of the companies I work with is an advisor, an investor in the, this cyber domain. And, most people didn't have a clue. And you've had a long experience in this area yourself. And one of the problems was that too many of the people in the C-suite, and this didn't just include the executives, but also the directors, they would say, I have no understanding what all this is about. I'll just leave it to this nerdy person, the CISO, the chief information and security officer. And that's actually not good enough. I mean, everyone's got to be alert to it because awareness is the big issue, because you can have all of your government systems well protected or think they are, but the government is dealing with people all the time, and so there's so many different vectors and angles. So, a lot of this is, you can see, again, things have moved on and evolved and improved enormously since that strategy was published. But, you look at the way the Australian Signals Directorate, reaches out to, the rest of Australia, to the private sector, with all of its hygiene rules. And this is all basic stuff. But at the end of the day, most compromises come about because of a compromise of identity, as you know. So it's often basic things. Often it's just someone with administrative privileges doing the wrong thing. I mean, look what happened. The NSA has suffered that. So what chance do law firms and businesses have? Awareness is the key. Awareness is the key, and sharing. I mean, the ISAC sort of structure in the United States is absolutely world leading. We are doing more of that in Australia, but I think there's a way to go. So it's a very dynamic frontier, and our adversaries are very smart. They're not good people, but they're very smart, and we've got to be as smart as them, and it's constantly evolving. So
Okay, so there's a couple of things in there which stood out for me. Going back to your comment in 2015, people not being as digitally as astute as perhaps they should be. How did you really react to that? And I ask this because, I mean, look, if you were saying like in the 80s, KB, people weren't digitally astute, I get that. But 2015, whilst it in the tech world, it seems a lot longer, but this is still the problem that people are having. You made a great point before around, it's the CISO's problem. Well, sure, but everyone is now being held accountable. There's all this new regulation out there that everyone's responsible and people are, panicked about it, which I understand. So were you sort of taken aback by that? Because I mean, look, 2015, yes, whilst it was a long time ago, still not ages ago.
No, but you would be amazed, right? I mean, you would be absolutely amazed. There was quite a lot of unfamiliarity. I'll give you an example. I mean, this is before 2015, but just so the internet basically went mainstream. I'm going to say 1995. Started becoming. I'm not. You'd have a better understanding of this than me, but I think it was becoming mainstream by 1995. I joined Goldman Sachs, became a partner of that firm in the late 90s. And of course, I had the Aussie Mail background and, I was familiar with, the internet technology such as they were at the time. And I remember I was at Goldman and they had voicemails. Goldman Sachs ran on voicemail. They had a very sophisticated voicemail system. In fact, it was awesome. It was really incredible. But I remember I'd sent an email to a colleague in New York and hadn't heard from him. And I, sent him voicemail message and said, hi, sent you an email about XYZ, what's doing. Can you let me know what you think? And he came back and he said, oh, really sorry. I haven't looked at my emails this week. It blew my mind. Absolutely blew my mind. Now, so, one of the things that with technologies, as we all know, is that both adoption and awareness and, interest is very, very, it doesn't proceed at the same pace with everybody. It's the old story, you get the early adopters and then it can take a while for others to catch up. So it was it's a while. I mean, I know 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, I know, senior people, senior business leaders, government leaders who would get their secretary, quote unquote, to print off all their emails because they didn't like reading anything on a screen. Well, again, that would seem to be almost eccentric today. So you can't. And the other thing, too is, I mean, you had, I remember we had a company called Web Central. We a major shareholder in a company called Web Central, which was affiliated with Aussie Mail, and we, retained our interest in it after we sold Aussie Mail to in 99. That was a web hosting company and was one of the first providers of, Microsoft's sort of managed exchange product, which was just, a hosting product. And so naturally you were, the salespeople were trying to persuade people not to, have their exchange server sitting, in a box, in their office, but rather, at the Microsoft data center, in the cloud, as it were. But, one of the pushbacks was, security. And you're saying, well, look, okay, you've got this little server sitting in your office and it's right next to the coffee maker. It's between the coffee maker and the fridge in the back office. And, there's a tin of biscuits sitting on top of it. And you think that's safer than being in the managed data center run by Microsoft, who's got people focused on this 24/7. And they sure as hell aren't leaving tins of biscuits or coffee makers next to the racks of servers. Yeah, so it was a different world. We used to have a term then called box huggers. So, the people said, no, you can't take away my little server.
Well, I was laughing in the background on mute when you were talking for those who are listening and can't see. Because it's all too familiar. I'm super familiar with this. I've worked in this space. I've seen it. Like I literally saw someone with a password on a post-it note not that long ago in a big company. So these things literally are happening. So it was just so familiar the way you're describing it.
Well, did you know what the most common passwords at Aussie Mail when we got started?
Password 1.
Yeah. We had password 1. Computer was very popular. Internet was very popular. And I mean, this gets, we're now moving into the signals intelligence area, which I've got to be very careful talking about, but that you would be amazed, how many devices on networks still have, as the administrative password is still, 1234 or 0000 or whatever it was set, by the factory before it was sent out. People don't change things. So, yep.
And that's why it's important to hear it from someone like yourself, given your former role, right? So I think that that's what's important, because I think there's this assumption in the space, as you're probably well aware of, that, oh, people understand these things. I don't think that they do. And I think it's really important to have these discussions for people of your caliber to be able to disseminate this information, because unfortunately, we're so much in our own echo chamber in this space. So that's why it's imperative to hear that. One of the things you mentioned before, Mr. Turnbull, would be sharing. Now, this one is interesting. So I'm familiar with the ISAC folks in the US, but also in Australia. When the Medibank breach occurred, the CISO working at the company at the time, I know him, and we've actually conducted a podcast interview off the back of that breach to really get inside what was happening for him, his stuff. That got a lot of pushback internally, like, corporate comms and internal, affairs and all these sort of people, external, internal lawyers. Like, I don't know how many people probably listened to that for hours on end. But the thing is, people say, and you make a great point, so I really want to get into this, sharing, but then when people like me go and knock on my door, it's like they don't want to be seen. They don't want to look like, oh, well, I potentially failed while I was in the job. Well, I can't get another job because I was the guy that had the breach attached to them.
Yeah, of course, sure. Well, it's like it's human nature, right? Nobody wants to own up, but you've got to have a regime, and we've addressed this in Australia with the SOCI, the Security of Critical Infrastructure legislation. Where there is mandatory reporting. That's very important. Companies are very loath to fess up, and they don't want to tell their customers about it. But it's really important. Because unless you basically got, you've got to say, we're all in the same. You got to say, whose side are you on? Are you on the side of the ransomware gangs, or the foreign actors that are trying to penetrate our networks, the cyber criminals, or you're not? If you're not on the side of the criminals, then basically we've got to share intelligence between each other. It's very, very important to do that. And that's, it's as simple as that, really. So, yep, it's as we all know, the cost of cybercrime keeps on going up. Yeah. You, Carissa, and everyone on your listening to this podcast knows that. So it's no point going through the basics. But I think, again, getting back to Semperis, which I guess is how this discussion came about, it's focused on the most common vector of, interference or, infiltration of malware, etc., which is through compromised identity systems. That is 93% of ransomware attacks in Australia come from compromised identity systems. So, and that's very often people clicking on the wrong hyperlink, or, having a dumb password or whatever. And of course, the ability to just crunch, most passwords can be found with enough effort. So, hence the need for other ways of securing identity,
In fintech, trust is everything, and proving it shouldn't slow you down. Whether you're dealing with ISO 27001, SOC 2, CPS 234, or GDPR, Vanta helps you demonstrate security and compliance without derailing your roadmap. Used by thousands of fast-moving, regulated companies, Vanta automates the hard part so your team can focus on shipping features, not gathering screenshots. Visit vanta.com/KBKast. That's VANTA.com/KBKast to learn more. So I want to move on now and talk about, during your government, Australia moved earlier than perhaps many peers around sovereignty or even foreign interference, vendor risk, etc. So when you look at Australia today, where do you think our deepest strategic exposure really now sits? Like telco, cloud, there's depends who you ask, but I really want to understand from your perspective.
Well, look, people always say to me, what keeps you awake at night? And the answer is I tend to sleep well, so nothing much keeps me awake at night, thank God. But if I was of a disposition to be kept awake at night, I would be mostly worried about industrial control systems. I mean, I am concerned about, ransomware attacks and stealing data, but it's the threat that you don't know about. The malware that has been infiltrated into the whatever, the electricity network, the telecom network, the hospital network that is just sitting there and, is burrowed into your system. And some of these are pretty old, particularly with utilities, and is, just waiting to pull the trigger and shut things down. So you've got to actually be able to hunt out what is, what could be there. And you've got to pay a lot of attention. You can't just assume that an incursion into your network will be found out because someone's going to then demand a ransom.
Okay, so talking about critical infrastructure for a moment, this is interesting. So a lot of the people I interview on this show talk, especially if I focus on Australia, like how quickly like telco goes down and then, the power grid, and it's a domino effect quite quickly. The part that I'm interested in, and you would have a lot more insight than this than I would, is Australia's reaction. Look at through COVID, the toilet paper, people going nuts over it. People still raise that with me today living in the States. Now with the fuel crisis, Australians seem to really react to when they can't get something, as opposed to, I live in the United States now, like, yes, there is a reaction there. It does seem heightened, though, across the Australian people. Do you have any insight as to
I
why?
think Australians are more inclined to panic than Americans. Well, you're an Australian living in America, so you'd be the best one to judge, because I would love to say Australians are stoic and, phlegmatic and keep calm and carry on. But you're, Carissa, you are much better able to make that comparison than me because you've lived in both countries. But I would say the only thing I'd say is the media does tend to beat up they tend to generate the panic, right? I'm sure there are some people that still haven't got through the toilet paper stockpile they accumulated during COVID. Thankfully it doesn't go off, so they'll be okay. But yeah, everything's connected, right? So there's a great deal of vulnerability. And you see, you get, if you look at it sort of in the area of warfare, conflict, if a foreign country or, a terrorist group fires a missile and blows up, takes down your power station, and a whole lot of the electricity network goes down. That's, obviously bad, but it's very clear. You can attribute it. You can see where the missile came from. It's very clear. If it is done by cyber means, it can have exactly the same effect, but it's often harder to attribute. And even if your agencies know who is responsible, and even if you say, right, this was, the North Koreans, we know it was the North Koreans, they can just say, no, it wasn't us. No, you were fooled, somebody else. And it is, there is always, with cyber attacks, there's always an element of plausible deniability. Sometimes you might say it's implausible deniability, but it does create these challenges. And so if you find yourself, we're looking at what Donald Trump and Israel are doing to Iran at the moment, and taking out so much of their infrastructure and threatening to take out even more, with missiles. And there's no question who's doing it. Trump's boasting about it. But imagine if all that was being done with cyber means. And then, the Iranians would say, well, we know it's the Israelis, or the Americans, because they're our enemies. They could easily say, no, it wasn't us. Look further afield. It creates a lot of ambiguity and makes it harder for governments to respond. And this is why, a lot of people will say to you in the, military world, they will say an attack, a cyber attack that destroys or, brings down a bunch of critical infrastructure should be treated the same way as if it is done in a kinetic fashion. So with, bombs and missiles and so forth. But the reality from a political point of view is that it is very hard to get the, public support and political support to start firing missiles after a cyber attack, because there would be people who would say, well, isn't that, excessive, disproportionate escalation? And that is why one of the other things we did around the time of the cyber strategy is we acknowledged that ASD had offensive cyber capabilities. And this is a big feature. Offensive cyber, I might say, is a big feature of President Trump's cyber strategy for America, just published in March, just this month, in March 2026. You've got to be able to have the ability, and not just have the ability, but you got to have the ability and acknowledge you have the ability, so everybody knows that you can go after your adversaries with cyber means when they can. So in other words, they can't think that just because they're saying, oh no, it wasn't us, that A, you won't know, and B, you can't do the same back again. It's a really important point of deterrence.
So going back to the attribution, would you say, and I'm listening to what you're saying, and what's coming to my mind is out of sight, out of mind. So what I mean by that is with cyber, you can't sort of see it. You can see a missile though coming out and something happens. So if I go out in the street and I punch someone, they're going to presumably they feel the pain of the punch versus a cyber attack. You don't see it coming and then it completely overturns companies. It rattles them. So do you think that perhaps historically speaking, it was something cybersecurity was relegated because we couldn't see the impact, especially everyday people. They can't see it. Yes, their money being stolen out of their bank account. I've worked in a bank. I've seen it. I've been on the front lines of these people being impacted. But it's one of those things that I've noticed in my time, and I'm curious to get your thoughts. Is it because people just can't see it? Therefore, it's like, oh, well, we've forgotten about it a little bit.
I think that's part of it, Carissa. I think the other part is, and this is the really problematic part, is that a lot of this is normalized and it's just treated as a sort of cost of business. Yeah, okay, yep. Identities were stolen. The Qantas frequent flyer, database has been hacked. People go, oh well, okay, that happens all the time, and people feel it isn't such a big deal, but it is. We don't want this to be normalized. Let me put it this way: we wouldn't accept, a gang of thieves, robbing every shop in, or Orlando or New York, and just accept that as, oh, well, that just happens, you got to accept people are coming in stealing all the time. We'd be saying, the police have got to do something about this. They've got to catch them and lock them up and so forth, throw away the key. However, there is a tendency, I think, because it isn't as dramatic, because there isn't that physicality, for people to just shrug their shoulders about it and almost treat it as a cost of doing business, which, is very dangerous. So I imagine and again, I'm not on top of this, you would be much more than me, but I imagine the thing that will make a big difference in this area is when you get companies being sued by their customers or their counterparties because of loss occasioned to those customers and counterparties by the company failing to have adequate cybersecurity protections.
And there are those class actions trickling through at the moment that you would have seen. It's happening a lot in the States. Do you go back to the normalized piece? And this is interesting because I've asked people on the show, do you think customers are desensitized? So when we're, doing interviews like this, I'm always looking in the comments on social media. What does the average Australian person think? Most people literally say, oh, well, I was in the last 10 breaches, so who cares? So it seems to be a common trend. So people desensitize. What motivation then does a business to actually put money behind and secure their customers when it's like, oh, well, Betty and Johnny don't care anyway?
That's right. And I mean, I think this is where this is where you can criticize a lot of things about the American legal system. Everyone hates it except for the lawyers, I guess. But the class actions that have a way of holding corporations, including very big corporations, to account. And, you're seeing this with the litigation against Facebook and Google, right? Just in the last week. So I think that's a liability. Any company that is not able to demonstrate that it is doing absolutely everything it can to protect its data and its customers' data and so forth is very, very unwise. I mean, you cannot be complacent. And, this is a message for CISOs, by the way. Like an interesting thing. I mean, I don't want to name names, but, as you know, I'm involved with quite a few cybersecurity companies. You mentioned Casada, an Australian company started by a very brilliant young guy called Sam Crowther. And we're talking about Semperis. And there are quite a few others that I'm involved with. It's an area that I'm very interested in. And sometimes I get involved in, the sales process. And typically it begins with a CISO. And sometimes, like the good CISOs, have always got an open mind. If they want to know what's going on and someone's got a new product or a new idea, come in, let me have a look at it. You want to do a proof of concept? Yep, absolutely. Let's do it. That's how you learn. But then you get other people who have a sort of not invented here approach, and they will say, no, 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 no. We've always done it this way. We're okay. There's no problems, nothing to see here. And I've found that increasingly with companies that have got CISOs like that, you've got to go to this. If you're in the software business or security business, you've got to go to the CEO. You've got to get into the CEO, because the CEO will often say, and I've had this quite a few times, he or she will say, okay, so these guys are offering us a POC. What have we got to lose? I mean, this is a free measure and quote. Okay. Why would we not look at that? I mean, and you see, and that's where the chief executive is smarter, because they're saying not only, there could be a good product here, but they're saying we want to be in a position where if anyone says we're not keeping everything up to scratch, we can say we not only have we got the suite of protections that we think are the best, that our advice best, but we regularly look at ways of upgrading it, alternates, and so forth. We're always on the front foot, because the defense, you don't have absolute liability legally for these kind of incursions, or, you might contractually, depends what you've told your customers, but let's assume you haven't. Your obligation is basically to act reasonably and responsibly. And so if you've done everything that, a reasonable, responsible person would do to protect their data, then, you're probably in pretty good shape, even if you are later breached.
So look, I know you're not Nostradamus, but
Thank God for that.
do you think that Australia will start to go down? And I know they are starting to go down in terms of the class actions with Optus and Medibank and Friends. Do you think they'll go down that route now? There's more these companies follow the Americans on that? And you are right. They are a very litigious country.
Yeah, the system here is not as supportive for class actions, but they're definitely a feature of the landscape. I mean, it's not, insofar it's not as, both culturally and I think financially, it's not as supportive. But, there are litigation funders, and, it's got a lot of the features of the US. I mean, some of these things are, look, some of the class actions, particularly those, funded by people as a business, are basically trying to get companies to settle. Okay. So the company, and particularly where you get companies and businesses like the bank that you used to work for, that are effectively what I would call professional defendants. I mean, if you're a bank, you get sued all the time, right? So it's just cost of doing business, getting sued, and you want to try and mitigate your risk, have good lawyers, both in-house and out-house. But ultimately, you will settle a lot of cases, because you'll say, the cost of defending this is $5 million. I can settle it for $1 million. It's a no-brainer. Now, one of the big differences between Australia and the US, and really the US and pretty much everywhere else, is that in Australia, we have a fairly universal rule of the loser pays the winner's costs. And they don't have that in the States, or very rarely. It's the exception. And so that means that if you're got a class action and you're suing, a big company in Australia, are going to have, they will say, all right, we want security for costs. How do we know you're going to be able to cover the costs of this action? And so you're going to have to you're going to have some money, or put up some money, or your litigants are at personal risk. And so that provides a little bit of discipline. I mean, I've always felt that the US system would probably be better balanced if they did have a loser pays the winner's costs, principle.
Yeah, so I think it's a strategic lawsuit against public participation. So I think it's a frivolous lawsuit designed to silence like critics, like activists, journalists, for example, citizens. You probably heard of this. So used for power entities like big banks and friends
Yeah.
to intimidate. and to settle, I'm assuming.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's right. Well, I mean, people bring litigation for all sorts of reasons. I mean, big companies and politicians. Look at Donald Trump. I mean, he's brought litigation against also, normally politicians never sued. They took the view that you had to have a thick skin and people would say tough things about you. And in fact, in America, the defamation laws are very supportive of the press, to be honest. I'm surprised that Trump has sued, and I'm surprised that he got the settlements that he did. But yeah, litigation can be used to intimidate. But I guess what I'm saying is, just getting back to cybersecurity, if we get getting back to cybersecurity, you can't eliminate the risk of it, but the way to mitigate it is to make sure that your cybersecurity protections and culture is really up to scratch.
So I really want to talk about when you, Mr. Turnbull, introduced foreign interference reforms. You drew a hard line against conduct that was covert, coercive, corrupt. So then, in today's sort of grey zone environment where cyber operations, disinformation, economic pressure to critical infrastructure, which we just touched on before, they intersect, right? As you know. So has Australia developed a credible doctrine of deterrence and response, or would you say we're still reacting case by case?
Oh, no, I think there is very much a doctrine of deterrence and response, but equally you do deal with it case by case, right? So you do both. You have a law in the statute books about, murder, but nonetheless, the homicide squad is dealing with it case by case. So we braided our foreign influence and foreign interference legislation at the end of 2017. It's when I introduced it, and the Parliament was passed about the middle of the following year. Yeah, that was well ahead of most countries, and it was really just designed to bring our Cold War espionage legislation into the 21st century. In terms of critical infrastructure, that was again, the focus on that began when I was PM and continued under Prime Minister Morrison and Prime Minister Albanese. Came about in an interesting way. There was electricity utility that belonged to the state government of New South Wales, which they were proposing to sell a half of, raise money to spend on other things, perfectly sensible thing for a state government to do. And the China's state grid was the bidder. Now, they'd already bought energy assets in Australia in the past. And this transaction, needed in the consent of the federal government, which was all on track to be given until somebody from within our system pointed out that there were some national security aspects to this that were a bit unique and may not be such a great idea for this to have half of it sold to a Chinese state-owned company. And so we stopped the sale. The state government I've written about this in my book, A Bigger Picture, so if people want to read more about it, can read it there, but it's an important lesson. So I apologized to Xi Jinping about it. I said, look, I'm really sorry. We should have told you this was a no-go zone right at the start, okay? Because they obviously spent a ton of money on due diligence and so forth, and then we said at the last minute, you can't do the deal. So it wasn't a high point of business-like behavior on our part. And President Xi was understanding about this. I mean, there's a ton of things we couldn't invest in China, and we're entitled to ring fence certain types of assets in our own country. So we don't make absolutely no apologies for that. But it's better to tell people up front, obviously. And what became obvious to me was that there were silos in government that were not talking to each other, very familiar problem. But secondly, we didn't actually have any agreement on what was critical infrastructure. What is critical infrastructure? But, at that stage, there was no definition for it. So we set up a register of critical infrastructure and then, a whole legislative regime developed. But it was literally something that had not properly been paid attention to. And it was being dealt with in quite an unsystematic way. And so basically the change that started under my time, and it was triggered by this incident, was one to be much more focused and systematic about it. Now, on telecoms, which of course relates to cybersecurity more than energy, well, energy does too, but telecoms very acutely, we had always been quite advanced in our legislation. So telecoms security legislation, which had been in place for some time, which we updated during my time, and it was a very keen focus. So we had the powers, for example, when as the telcos were looking to move to 5G, to be able to make a decision about whether we wanted to have what we called euphemistically high-risk vendors, which basically meant Huawei and ZTE, in the network. And we looked at it very carefully. It was not a political decision. It was not dictated by the Americans. In fact, we were way ahead of the United States on this. And we looked at it very carefully. And my concern was I kept on sending ASD back to do more homework because I said, find a way for us to mitigate the risk. Because I did not want to ban Huawei, frankly. I mean, because I wanted to have as many vendors in the mix, because that meant you'd have lower prices. Because clearly, if you chop out all of the Chinese vendors, the other ones, people like Ericsson and Nokia, will be able to charge more. So anyway, we came to the view that we couldn't mitigate the risk. And, there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. It relates to the virtualization of networks, the fact that, a lot of what had been core functions in telecom networks, wireless networks in particular, were now distributed throughout the network. I mean, that's how they reduced latency. So the old distinction between the core and the edge was really no longer relevant. And so we made that decision, and that was we had the legislative ability to do that, and we were perfectly polite about it. We didn't make a fuss about it, didn't bang any drums or try to get any political capital of it. We gave the Chinese companies and Chinese government, a heads up well in advance of the announcement. It was just good housekeeping. I think that's the way you've got to deal with these issues between states. I mean, there's a tendency, and, some other Australian politicians have done this, I think unwisely, there's a tendency to try to use decisions like this for political capital at home to show that you're a tough guy and, get the applause of the right-wing media. I think you've just got to say it's just risk management. And the way I try to express risk management in this context, Carissa, is all of us calibrate risk every day in our lives, right? There are things you would tell your wife or husband that you would not tell your best friend. There were things you will tell your best friend or your spouse that would not tell your colleague at work. There are things you'd tell your colleague at work you wouldn't tell somebody you meet on the bus. And so we're doing that all the time. And, the same goes with nations. So there is a level of trust we have with some countries that is higher than with others. And sometimes that's just a question of scale and history and culture and so forth. And we just got to be realistic about that. And instead of focusing on the areas where we have less trust, focus on the areas where we do have more trust.
And so, Mr. Turnbull, finally, if those are the lessons of, your time in office, what should the next Prime Minister learn, perhaps, from them?
Well, I think the key lesson is do not take anything for granted. Do not ever sink into complacency. The challenge is never met, and you have to be prepared every day to get up and be prepared to do things differently. You cannot assume that the world is the same as it was when you went to bed the night before, if you like. The scale and pace of change is greater than it has ever been in human history, and certainly in our lifetimes. So you've got to be prepared to look at things again. And there is set and forget is a very easy thing, particularly for governments. Let me close with this. I mean, this is a good example. In November 2015, I launched my first big economic policy agenda, which was called the National Innovation and Science Agenda, NISA. There are about 24 measures in it, as I recall. And a lot of it was focused on education, on investment, on, encouraging more money into venture capital to support startups. It was a ton of stuff there. And it did very well. I mean, it was a real inflection point in the innovation economy and innovation generally in Australia. So it was one of those things that by and large did work. But at the time, I remember a reporter saying to me, "Can you guarantee that all of these measures will work?" And I said, "No, I cannot. I cannot." I said, "I hope they all do. These are the best ideas we have at the moment. Those things that work, we will do more of. Those things that don't work, we will dump. If we see somebody achieving our goals with methods and techniques that we haven't thought of, we will shamelessly plagiarize them." And I mean, this is one of the problems that governments have, and I think business leaders have this too, is they set the wrong expectations. You should not say this endeavor, this plan, this bit of legislation, this policy, this investment in this new sales agenda, I guarantee it is going to deliver X, Y, Z. You can say, this is the best idea we've got at the moment. We hope it will do X, Y, Z, but we are monitoring it very carefully. And if it underperforms, we will cut it quick and do something else. I always found if you set the expectations right at the outset, it gives you a lot more flexibility.
Mr. Turnbull, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Carissa. Great to see you and chat with you.
This is KBKast, the voice of cyber.
Thanks for tuning in. For more industry-leading news and thought-provoking articles, visit kbi.media to get access today.
This episode is brought to you by Mercsec, your smarter route to security talent. Mercsec's executive search has helped enterprise organizations find the right people from around the world since 2012. Their on-demand talent acquisition team helps startups and mid-sized businesses scale faster and more efficiently. Find out more at mercsec.com today.